Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 78. And there's no secret that true crime has really taken off in the world. And Chicago is home to many of a true crime story, especially with like Gacy and even have Jeffrey Dahmer that kind of happened here in Wisconsin. But there's one that has been like unsolved for years. Nobody really knows a true story of it. And that is the Brown's chicken murders that happened years ago. A friend of mine, his name is Patrick, wrote a new book about the Brown's Chicken murders. It's called Something Big, the true story of the Brown's Chicken Massacre. He has a book signing today in Skokie at 6 o'clock, I believe, right at the Barnes and Noble. So we're talking to him now. Patrick, how are you?
Hey, great, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's funny in Chicago specifically, there's a lot of like true crime that has originated out of here. So many things. I mean, people think of John Wayne Gacy. There's also, Jeffrey Dahmer and a bunch of other random things. And the Brown's Chicken Massacre, I remember vividly as a kid seeing it in the news every day, which felt like a year. And then it kind of just, disappeared into the ether. Nobody really knew what happened forever. But you have a new book about said massacre. Why don't you shed a little light on it, if you will, about like the beginning of it and what you found?
Sure, sure. So, obviously, like you mentioned, this is a story that people in Chicago know very well because it happened in 1993 and then it lingered a long time. It
Yeah,
was
right.
unsolved for 9 years. And then there was obviously the aspect with it being associated with Brown's Chicken, the restaurant, which in that time was huge. It was ubiquitous in Chicago. It was all over the place.
Yeah, it kind of
And
ruined Brown's Chicken.
it did. Although I will make a pitch for Brown's Chicken. It is still around and quite good.
It's
So
fantastic. It was my family's
yes,
favorite.
yes,
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't
they
live
are.
anywhere near Palatine, so that's fine.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because um, people have asked me, "What's your connection to this story?" And I grew up not too far from Palatine. I'm not far. I'm not from Palatine originally, but grew up in the northwest suburbs. Although when I need to lie and say I'm from the city, I tell people I'm from Edison Park. So that's my little white lie. I guess I've outed myself there. But in any case. Uh, Grew up in that area. I'd always heard about it, like you mentioned, as a lot of Chicagoans had. And there was a franchise in Park Ridge, so I grew up eating there all the time, and people remember the
Oh, so you grew up
advertising
in
and
Park
everything.
Ridge. I got you.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
sitting about 2 blocks from Superdog.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
a great, another great establishment.
And I
So,
used to live right across from Brooks Park in Edison Park.
oh, okay. All right. Well,
Yeah,
then you know it well. So,
I do. Yeah.
but to your question, this is a story, like you said, that people know. It's
Mhm.
been talked about a lot. There actually have been other books. There was one that was done by a Chicago Tribune reporter, actually right after the case was solved, or the two men who did this were arrested, but it was done before the trials. So there was a lot of information that was left out of it. Obviously,
Mhm.
the whole trial piece and the resolution was left out. And there's podcasts on this case every couple months, quite frankly, episodes about the case. But it was often done by people who had no connection to the area. They pronounced the names of things wrong.
Ugh, that drives me
Uh,
nuts.
it's yes, it does. Palatine and
Yeah.
all great things like that. But most importantly, they really left out the stories of the people involved in
Mhm.
this case. And I always walked away wanting to learn more about that. And in particular, in this book, we can talk more about this. I tried to really tell a genuine story about, of course, the people investigating, the lawyers, people in the community, but above all, the victims, and tried to share their story in a much more humane way than others had in the past. So I've been pleased by the response so far.
Well, could you do me a favor for folks who might not have heard of this? If you could just like what came out in the news versus what eventually was uncovered to what you are saying about them. I know you mentioned a little bit about you talked about the people a little bit more versus just treating them as perhaps statistics in this awful murder. But folks who haven't heard about the massacre before they jump on Google to look it up, why don't you just give them a little bit of like what it was and then what eventually led to the convictions that happened?
Sure, sure. So in January of 1993, there were 7 employees five employees and the two owners of a Palatine franchise of Brown's Chicken who were cleaning up on a Friday night, and two men came in and and killed them,
Hmm.
and they were, of course, found in the restaurant. And while investigating, the crime scene became a huge media sensation. People were there instantly wondering what had happened. And one of the very shrewd investigators who was on the scene at the time noticed that, well, it was actually a number of people noticed that there were empty chicken bones in the garbage cans, which were clean because they had been cleaning up that night, the employees, before this happened. So they decided to save the chicken. One of the investigators in particular took it and froze it. And this ended up
Wow.
becoming very important down the line. At this point in 1993, there wasn't the technology available to extract a DNA sample from saliva from chicken.
Uh-huh.
So people kind of gave her interesting looks about the decision to freeze that, but it ended up being pivotal because that is how the crime was solved. And that's what most people know about this, is
Right.
that connection to the chicken bone. And the men were
Bizarre story in general,
of
because things like that did not happen in Palatine, right? Like, it's just a very unusual thing. This happened in maybe another part of the city, not so unusual. Terrible, yes, but maybe not as unusual, but definitely unusual in Palatine.
Well, I like to think that this shouldn't happen anywhere. A
Right.
massacre of 7 people, of course, but that is, Tom, something that people said a lot, especially when you go through. I obviously interviewed a lot of people for this, but it's also interesting to go through the news clips and the TV footage and all the newspapers and do it kind of chronologically. And one of the things you notice is just how it was reported at that time. And so that was a common refrain from a lot of people, is, oh, it shouldn't happen in Palatine. And
Yeah, it shouldn't happen anywhere. You're right.
I
Yeah.
talked to the no, but it's an interesting thing because I talked to the mayor of Palatine, who was she was mayor for over 20 years, Rita Mullins. She was an interesting character. But that was one of the points she made, was she didn't like when people said that, because her whole thing was, yes, of course it shouldn't happen in Palatine, but definitely anywhere. But I think that did create sort of a fear in the community, though, too, because
Sure.
they're not used to dealing with such an intense crime. And we can talk about the criticism that people faced and whether it was valid, which is one of the things I really get into in the book.
Ah, and so with that criticism, you then interweave the stories of the people. Like, so what did you find that was interesting that made you want to then publish the book, and tell this side of the story?
Sure. So I'll give you a couple of examples
Sure.
of some of the people I talked to, the stories I found were interesting, and why this was worthy of another look at things. So I obviously spoke to some of the victims' families. The owners of the restaurant were Lynn and Dick Ehlenfeld, and they had moved from Wisconsin to open this franchise. That was well, they had moved for another job, but this was a transition they made, opening this restaurant in Palatine. I talked to their daughters, who talked about their lives of their parents, and I really tried to keep it on that,
Hmm.
focusing on what they had done before, their decision to open it, their travels, and all the things they had done living across the United States. They had a very interesting life before they did this. So I think there's a lot people will learn about them and the stories of other individuals. I also spoke to the friend of one of the way the crime was resolved is one of the ex-girlfriends of the killers came forward and essentially broke the case open. That allowed police to collect DNA samples and then connect it to the chicken bone. So I talked to one of the friends who
Wow.
was the person who convinced Ann Lockett, the woman who came forward, to come forward. And she told me about different hints that Ann Lockett was sort of leaving over the years, that they would take walks around the empty building and uh, in the lot around Brown's Chicken and Palatine, and she would ask things like, "Oh, do you think people wonder?" And she was trying to kind of come forward, which I think is something people don't know. Obviously, she should have come forward sooner, well, and but there's an interesting angle to that too. I'm not sure people necessarily would have believed her had she come forward very early on. So
Ah, really?
one of the sisters of one of the victims I spoke to made that point. She said, you know, obviously it took a long time. It was a lot of pain, and they wish it had been solved earlier. But the way the DNA evidence came together, and them needing time for that technology to develop, as well as her coming forward, really was the connection there. That if she had done that in 1993, they wouldn't have been able to get the DNA, and it kind of would have just been her word against the two killers. And she had a spotty past with drug use and alcohol. She was in a treatment facility during this time. And so they probably would have portrayed her as just someone who's totally not to believe versus the two men who had no record, essentially. So it's an interesting point.
Oh, that's fascinating because you're dead on, no pun intended. Sorry. Just
No,
you're
all good.
um because the way, I mean, especially nowadays when you watch documentaries and everything else, that's exactly what they do. They try to find the flaw in anybody that is trying to, to pin something on somebody, or say they have evidence to put somebody away. They go after the character and rip them apart, right? Because to show them that they're, incompetent or not trustworthy or what have you. So
Absolutely. Well,
in the end though, like, did they ever, again, for those who might not have heard of this, like, what was the reasoning? Why did this whole thing happen? Was it just bad luck for people, or somebody crossed somebody, or what's your take?
well, it was kind of just a sick thrill kill, I suppose. They that's one of the lingering questions of this, is the motive that was given was that the two men, Juan Luna and James Degorski, wanted to do, quote, something big. And so that's obviously the title of the book. And I try to sort of flip that on its head
Hmm.
in the book, talking about all of the other big things that the people who passed were doing. But yeah, it's a question that lingers for people, and I try to ask some of the police that I spoke to, or crime scene techs, or the attorneys, the prosecutors and defense attorneys who worked on these cases later, what they thought of that. And it's just one of those unfortunate things that we'll not really ever have an answer to. And I think for people who are interested in true crime stories, it's unique because after this happened in 1993, both Juan Luna and James Degorski ended up living pretty normal lives. They didn't
That's terrifying.
really, yeah, they didn't really get into trouble. There were a few, minor things, but Juan Luna had a family, he got married, had a kid, was working, living in the suburbs, and it was particularly sad just because these were people living among their neighbors. They had gone to Fremd High School, and some of the people they killed were students at Palatine High School. So these were people in their community, which I really think shocked people when their identities were revealed and when they were caught in 2002 and arrested.
Yeah, it's almost a story that it's like unbelievable for the, just to do something big or to like get there. I mean, here we are talking about it. So, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what they were hoping. I'm sure
Mhm.
by 2002, though, they thought they completely had gotten away with it, right? I mean, after a year or two, they were probably like, "Oh, we're good." Like nobody said anything. Like that's why they went on and moved on to their, their everyday lives and did that, which is also terrifying when you really think about it. Like, like it's interesting, worthy of a book, and you did just that. So, oh, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that happened right away too is sometimes people ask, well, what's some of the evidence? Or there's a tendency in today's online sleuth culture of people to be overly skeptical of
Hmm.
things. But James Degorski admitted it right when he was arrested to police. They talked about it in the car ride home. And then they both eventually confessed on camera, and obviously they had the DNA connection. So it was all very, very solid and kind of tied up in the end there. But obviously they've since changed their story and did during the trial, unfortunately. But
I remember too, the thing that scared people the most was the chicken bones that people they went there and they did this massacre of people, and then they wanted to eat afterwards and like almost enjoy the fruits of their labor that was that massacre. And that's the part that's the twisted, dark, terrifying part.
Yeah, well, they ate before they did all this because they wanted to just sort of I don't know. We'll never know exactly why they did it, but it was sort of just to get a lay of the land, or it's not quite clear. But one of the things I wanted to mention too is
Mhm.
just because this took so long to be solved, there were a lot of ups and downs. Obviously, there were different suspects that came and went, and so I tried to touch on the stories of those people too. So, for example, I talked to Martin Blake. He was an ex Brown's Chicken employee. He had been fired a couple weeks before this happened. So he kind of looked like maybe a suspect. He was kind of a quirky guy, and someone brought in a tip to the police and said he was the guy. So he was taken into custody, and questioned for 2 days, and the amount of media attention that his name got was insane. I mean, he was the front page of every newspaper,
Yeah.
all over the radio constantly. ABC7 had somehow got his home videos of him throwing parties and things at his house, and aired those. And
Oh
so,
gosh, that's
you know,
terrible.
and it was all in the context of here's the guy,
Yeah,
when it
the
was,
public opinion already had him guilty.
and it's like putting toothpaste back in the tube. You just it's hard to take that away. And so I talked to him about how this destroyed his life, and he
Yeah.
eventually had to leave the state. And he did nothing wrong. There was nothing connecting to him. And obviously he was released pretty quickly. But it was the media is certainly an interesting aspect of this too, just because it was so intense at that time.
Yeah, as somebody who's worked in the media for most of his adult life, I can tell you firsthand that it's shocking on what you hear. I'm not, saying names, but it's shocking what you hear, at least back in the day. Maybe not so much now, just because now it's different for a variety of reasons. But back in the day, what stations would do to get the story, to be number one in the ratings, to get that thing. I mean, there was reporters that did terrible things when there was like the Lacey Peterson stuff or a bunch of other stuff that's happened. Like I said, there's no shortage of like terrible stories that have happened in our area, and there's no shortage of media exploiting it.
And there's certainly some of that here for sure. And this is certainly not a media bashing book or anything like this,
No.
but it's part of the story there. And I think you can differentiate between, especially then, the newspaper reporters and radio reporters and others who were a little more sticking to just telling the facts and what's happening. But TV, you've got to have compelling visuals. And
Video,
so,
video, video. Yeah.
yeah. And that was, again, not a knock on the media. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but that was a consistent criticism I heard from police, friends and families of victims, that they kind of wanted the cameras to maybe stop a little sooner than they had. That was interesting. There was one point when the Palatine police weren't really looking into a suspect that was being reported as a, a credible person in the news, and they weren't doing that because they had information behind the scenes that they couldn't share because it was part of this not public investigation
Hmm.
showing that it wasn't this guy. And so you had some reporters meddling a bit in the investigation, saying basically, if you don't investigate this, we will put this embarrassing story on the news, saying that you are not following these leads and you're fumbling the investigation. And so they went and tried to investigate it. And it's like a scene from TMZ when you've got cameras in the bushes and that sort of thing. And obviously the lead ended up being nothing, but it was just an example of, I think, how difficult this was for the police to to deal with this as well. They will tell you that they don't pay any attention to the media, but it's
Yes, they
certainly,
do.
I think it makes it tough, for sure. Yes.
In Chicago, they might, I mean, I think every police officer would say that they don't care about what the media has to think until they care about what the media has to think. I mean, that's kind of at least my observations over the years. I mean, I imagine too that because it's Palatine and not Chicago or a bigger city like Naperville or Rockford or Joliet or what have you, I imagine they might have been a little overwhelmed at that in 1993 Palatine. I can't imagine. I mean, it's much different today than it was then, but I imagine the police force, just the amount of attention that was put onto it and everything else, all the other influences from the FBI or what have you. I imagine it was overwhelming for these guys who were up until then, the women and men of that department were just kind of just doing their thing, and all of a sudden they are forced into national spotlight.
It was certainly nobody's prepared for that kind of investigation. And this is kind of one of the lessons that I talk about in the book is I think the Palatine police were, in the end, and I think you can see this with hindsight, unfairly criticized at the time. There's this notion that the case was somehow bumbled and or just completely botched, and that's not the case in my view. They knew from the beginning that they needed to bring in outside help, and so I talked to some of the officers who worked on the case, and within hours they brought in the FBI and all the three-letter agencies. They brought in some of the most experienced homicide detectives from Chicago. They borrowed police from other suburban forces, so they knew they weren't equipped to deal with this on their own, and they were willing to accept help. Definitely. One of the interesting parts about this case is that there's kind of a dynamic between the suburbs and the city, and cops who maybe think they know better than the Palatine police, and sort of whenever the investigation went in a direction that was a dead end or was a distraction, it tended to be the outsiders who thought they knew better who were sending it that way. So
Of course.
the Palatine police, I think, consistently made the right moves in those early days, and certainly there were ups and downs and errors like there are in any
Yeah.
police
Look at the OJ
investigation.
trial. Come on, that was Los Angeles. So like,
Yes.
you know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
I mean, if you dig deep enough on any investigation, you're gonna find things. But ultimately, this case was only going to be uh, broken by or solved in the way that it was, and that is someone coming forward. I want to mention one thing about the media, though,
Yeah.
too, just so I cover myself here.
Yeah.
Compliments to a lot of the reporters, especially Daily Herald and the Tribune and Sun Times, and uh, because they covered really and did great work on covering the stories of the people involved in a way that was much more in depth than other people. And in certain cases, I relied a lot on their work from that time. So there were a lot of people who did great work as well.
Was it tough to get these people so after so many years back to this story to talk about it, to share with it in a book?
Well, it's an interesting quandary, if you will, because it depends on who you're talking to. And you want to be respectful of the fact that while this is 30 years ago, it's still and forever will be fresh in the memories of a lot of people. And so whenever I was reaching out to people, I was always clear that if they didn't want to talk, I would never bother them again. I didn't hound people, and I found that most people wanted to talk,
Oh,
and
interesting.
were interested in talking, because I explained to them what I was trying to do, and that is focus less on the blood and the gore of this case and more on telling the stories of people. So I hope they feel that I kept this promise. There's been a lot of talk online and Instagram and TikTok from readers who've appreciated the kind of different focus of this book. It's kind of a unique in that sense, but it was a challenge to get people to talk. But for the most part, people wanted to, and um, I'm grateful for that, for sure.
Were you able to talk, and forgive me if I for not knowing this, if this person's still around today, because, it's been a few years. Were you able to talk to the investigator that froze the chicken?
She is a tough person to track down because she works now for, I believe, the CIA.
Who did she
So,
work for at the time?
she worked. It was the Northern Illinois Police Crime Lab. So
Oh,
it was a nonprofit lab that works with, suburban police departments. Um,
incredible though that wasn't the FBI, it wasn't the ATF or whatever. It was a nonprofit that somebody worked for that had the foresight to like, I'm gonna freeze this. Like, because we just figure it out later.
and that was her second crime scene, actually, working that she was working in, first murder too. So that's an interesting that
Incredible.
she knew to do that. But one thing I will say too is she often gets credit for finding the chicken, but that's not true. There's another officer who found it, others who pointed it out over over many days that they were processing the crime scene, but she ultimately is the one who decided that to freeze this and made that decision.
Yeah, I
And
imagine it was just eerie to see it.
one of the things one of the officers told me was that they kept the chicken just in a freezer in the in the police station. So they would joke sometimes, don't don't put that in with your leftover lasagna or something like that.
Wow. So it sat in the Palatine Police Department's freezer, wherever that was for this stuff. Was it that department?
Yeah, I think they had a special. I'm not exactly sure the exact
You
device
would
they
hope,
had,
right?
but
It
yes.
wasn't like a GE right in the middle of the break room, right?
No, they also it was stored for, I think, for a time at the lab too
Yeah.
for a while. So yeah.
Wow. Incredible story, really is, especially revisiting it as an adult, versus, I mean, I was 13 when that happened. So, either way, and you have a book signing at Barnes and Noble in Skokie, July 1st. What time are you? Is it 6 o'clock?
Yes, we'll be there at 6 o'clock. That's Tuesday, July 1st, 6 p.m. And then we also have an event in Lombard at Barbara's Books at 3 p.m. So if folks want to show up, we'd love to have them. They can sign up online if you just go to patrickwohl.com. There's an Eventbrite page there.
Oh, fantastic. And I imagine the Skokie one is kind of a cool uh, little perk for you just because it's down the street from Park Ridge.
Exactly. Yes.
Very cool.
So it'll be fun to see everyone, and so far the response has been very positive from people, and so I'm excited about that.
Well, I wish you nothing but the best and good luck at the book signings and all that good stuff. And where can people find your work outside of this if they want to continue to follow what you do?
Sure, they can go to my website and follow. This is my second book. Other one's about a political campaign. If you got any political junkies, that was legendary in the '90s. That came out about 2 years now, 2 years ago rather. So patrickwool.com, and follow me on Instagram, and feel free to shoot me a note.
All right, Patrick.